I'm going to thank my colleagues in spades because they've not only done sterling work all day, but are now going to distill that for all of our thinking. I must say, let me just give you a few of my own thoughts while we are assembling here. And we really have managed what was deliberate in the program to create real dilemmas of where you wanted to be. I found myself really torn again and again, including between the Middle East and the US. And we found that right through the day. And thank you all for your tremendous questions, which have woven such a breadth of experience into the discussion we've had here. We really have covered everything from space to the bottom of the oceans and every country and region in the world, I think, right down to Manchester, now its own resonant word within British politics. Of all the moving parts we have been discussing, indeed, the British government is one of those. Let me just chip in a few of my own thoughts just to get it going about what we've been hearing. Sanam ended up at the end of that session with the word optimism and saying how she was struck by actually the optimism that some of the speakers had found in this. And I must say, I have found that during today, that people have not been despairing. They have used all kinds of resonant words to describe the changing world order. But people have been very practical about how to make the best of it and how to strike new alliances, how to solve problems. And that is very much the spirit of this conference. And I'm very struck by how much people are talking about alliances that will be necessary, even if they're not formed yet, as in the last panel, to solve the problem of the Strait of Hormuz, or in Alex Krasodomski's earlier one on AI, to address the question of how to bring tech companies and what they're doing within some kind of agreed framework. But I didn't hear the kind of pessimism you did hear very frequently a couple of years ago. These companies are an all-out challenge to government that maybe cannot be contained. The second thing I don't know, I have here from my colleagues about China, but I didn't hear a resounding answer to the question, can the rest of the world produce anything that China wants to buy? And that is hanging there. But I did think there was a lot of optimism about trying to bring China into those solutions, whether it is in Ukraine or in the Middle East. And finally, I'm just very struck by how we're talking about the US in a very different way from even the way we would have done 6 months ago, precisely because of Iran. It has been a significant mistake, it seems to me, for the US president, one from which he is trying to extract himself at the moment, but one that has changed the way other countries deal with the US and its position in the world. So let me stop there and just turn to my colleagues. They can remind you of their names as we go along, and in case you haven't caught their sessions, and just see what they have found most striking about this day. Let me start at the end with David Lubin, our Senior Research Fellow on Economics.
Thank you very much, Bronwyn. I'm going to try and end with a note of optimism, if not hopefulness. There's been a lot of discussion during the course of the day about the word hegemony and the absence of what we used to call hegemonic stability. That phrase, hegemonic stability, was coined by an American economic historian called Charles Kindleberger, who wrote a fantastic book about the 1930s. And his argument was that the reason why the 1930s depression was so long and so deep is because there was an absence of hegemonic stability. The dominant power, Great Britain, was no longer able to uphold the international order and provide public goods, and the rising power, the United States, was not willing to step into that role. Arguably, what we have these days is a new form of that Kindleberger trap. But the difference is that at the moment, it's the dominant power, the United States, not so much that it's unable to provide public goods, but this administration is unwilling to provide them. And that, I think, offers some hope, because it at least means that we can kind of expect, or pretend to expect, that a post-Trump administration will regain the willingness to uphold international order and provide public goods, albeit in an altered form. But this administration may be a blip rather than a permanent trend. And I just think it's worth bearing in mind that this, making this kind of comment just a few weeks after Trump's visit to Beijing, in which China and the United States agreed a period of at least 3 years, taking us to the next US election, of what was commonly described as constructive strategic stability. So at least in terms of the bilateral relationship between the US and China, I think there is evidence of optimism, or there's evidence of kind of hopefulness for the next couple of years. And I think there may be a longer term case for hope beyond that.
David, thanks very much indeed. Olivia O'Sullivan, head of our UK and the World programme.
Bronwyn, thank you. And thanks to everyone for your participation in the conference today. One of the main things that struck me was how interesting and engaging the questions were that we had. I chaired 2 panels, one on European resilience in the face of the Russian threat, and one organised around advice for the next UK Prime Minister. So you'll forgive me if I don't meet David's challenge of sounding optimistic, because I think whoever he may be, he's going to have a difficult challenge. I think because of the nature of those 2 panels, one of the threads that struck out to me was the need to think about publics in all of these questions that we've been discussing around a fracturing international order, or an international order at least under strain, and the difficulty for elected officials of explaining to publics, particularly in Europe, what is required at this time, whether that's investing more in defence, whether that's meeting new types of security threat, or whether that's at the very least rethinking some of the core alliances of the post-war order. And getting that challenge right, not unduly alarming publics, but sufficiently warning them of those concerns and making the trade-offs and the necessary choices clear. That crystallized as one of the key challenges, certainly for the next Prime Minister of this country, a challenge that we haven't solved when it comes to how we'll invest more in defence, as a really tough challenge. And I think we should not forget how difficult it is. Many of the people on my panels were elected officials, to be in rooms like this and talk about ambitions for global order and hegemony, and then, certainly if you're a UK MP at the end of the week, speak to your constituents about the problems that are troubling them on their front doors. And reconciling those 2, the need to reconcile those 2, and the need to explain the trade-offs and choices required, struck me as one of the core challenges that they and we need to think about in these discussions.
Olivia, thanks very much indeed. Mark Weller, Professor Mark Weller, who's director of our Global Governance and Security Centre and our International Law Programme. You have 2 minutes.
Oh my God, the lawyers are always the most efficient ones. And our panel, of course, came up with an 8-point plan to resolve all problems of the world, or at least to restore confidence in the international rule of law. 2 minutes, let me try.
Or you can refer people to the Chatham House website, where your 8 points will be. Go ahead.
Well, Mr. Trump would have had 20 points, so at least I'm doing better than that. The first point, I think, where most people would have agreed, is that the rule of law in itself is a substantive value. It produces predictable, stable relations, enhances transactions, avoids or settles disputes, and provides security, provided all equally support the system and oppose those who seek to violate it. But we want to move from what was called the rules-based system, perhaps, to actually the real rule of law. The rules-based system has a little bit of an odious taste now in the South as sort of Western liberal imposed values. And I think if we focus on an objective concept of that kind, that would be helpful. Yes, we do have universal law and it still exists. We have universal institutions and they still exist. It's states that fail to make full use of them and to apply them. And where we need to change them because structural changes have occurred, that is possible. And we also need to find ways of accelerating lawmaking on new issues that arise. Global problems need global answers, and minilateralism will not always help us solve these issues.
Mark, would you forgive me if I took it? Mark runs an absolutely brilliant program, which is at the heart of our mission and of this conference. Knowing how brilliant it is, I'm going to point you to it and take that as a taster of it, but I really urge you to dive into that work. We turn to Sanam Vakil, who has been chairing this very intense session on the Middle East.
Very briefly, because I know time is of the essence, I think when thinking about what I engaged in today, I mean, the main messages are that while the region is very much in disarray with conflicts being very connected and metastasizing, there is much more regional agency, both in the domestic parameters of each conflict, but also regionally. There are more coalitions that have been built and are building, and without those coalitions, obviously, the conflicts will be left to fester. There needs to be more of this coalition building, and there was a very strong call that Europe and the UK should take a bolder and broader role in supporting the region and not just waiting for Washington or waiting for the conditions to be just right for them to intervene. I take the view that perhaps this is not a blip, what's happening in the United States. I appreciate your optimism, David, but in the coalition building and agency, I think states, non-state actors, NGOs and companies need to be always preparing for what they're not anticipating, and that's where agency in the region is also developing, building resilience to think about connectivity and to think about diversification, new supply chains, new development plans in order to prevent the next conflict from emerging.
Sanam, thank you very much for that. Well, that is a taster and can be no more of the brilliance of Chatham House. And I don't use that word lightly, but my colleagues are absolutely brilliant. And we all gain from that creativity. With that, we're going to end this session. The Foreign Secretary has now arrived, and we will go straight into that. You join me in thanking them. I'm staying on stage, but some chairs are leaving. Actually, I'm not. Actually, I'll come off if you want to get that. Great, thanks. welcome again, and a very warm welcome to the Foreign Secretary, Yvette Cooper. The briefest and briskest of introductions. Her time is immensely short. She's just back from Ankara into the usual intensity of meetings. She was, as you know, appointed Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs last year. She was previously Secretary of State for the Home Department since the government was elected. And she's one of the few ministers in this government who has extensive previous experience. Under Gordon Brown's government, she was Chief Secretary to the Treasury and Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, and under Tony Blair, Minister of State for Housing and Planning, Parliamentary Undersecretary of State for Regeneration, Regional Development, and I could list other things, but it would take us into time where we might otherwise be discussing the future of the world. Very warm welcome.
Thank you, Bronwyn.
Let me start with an article that you wrote for The World Today, our terrific magazine, full of intelligence, and it looks beautiful. One of the best reasons for becoming a member of Chatham House. You may get copies outside. You wrote this, it came out just a few days ago, and you set out in many ways what you thought Britain ought to be doing about its influence in the world. And that is very much what we've been talking about today in this conference, on the kind of alliances that can improve the order of the world. And I wanted to start with your point about Europe, because you said, I hope Britain can reach a cleaner and stable relationship with the EU. What did you mean by that?
So take one step back first, and then I'll come back to the Europe thing, which is, what I was seeking to describe was the sense of the huge instability and, frankly, the increased dangers that we face in the world now, from the geopolitics, geoeconomics, from climate change, from the pace of technology and the interaction between all of those things. There's no doubt when we look at the scale of this threat that we have currently a war in Europe that has been ongoing for longer than the First World War. We have the Strait of Hormuz and the impact that that is having on the global economy closed again. And of course, we have the pace of technology on things like AI, new threats, new challenges, as well as immense new opportunities as well. And the sense as part of that, what we need to do, what the UK needs to do, is to build our strengths, from defence to our economic security to our democratic resilience, to also use, we're more agile in our alliances, because it is the partnerships that we build abroad that make us stronger at home, and also to be more confident in our values, because from the rule of law to the importance of championing the rights of women and girls, there are so many areas where those values actually are about who we are and also give us strength in our foreign policy as well. In terms of how Europe fits into that, then my sense is that really we've been clear, we need to be working more closely with Europe, and security is the obvious example of that at a time when there is the threat from Russia, not just to Ukraine, but more broadly to Europe. But that shouldn't be about trying to go backwards to 2016. It should be about recognizing the world as it is now and what kind of relationship we need for the future. Now, there are some specific issues as part of the UK-EU reset that need to be fully implemented. But what I was just seeking to identify is that there is a risk for both the UK and the EU that we get into a sort of narrow, ongoing, sort of permanent state of negotiation, rather than having a shared vision around the future of Europe, where our security in Europe depends on what happens from the UK to Ukraine, from Norway to Turkey. None of those four countries are members of the EU. The EU is central in all of those. We all have different relationships with the EU, but actually we are part of a shared security infrastructure, and that should be the sort of underpinnings of the way in which we think about our European relationships, and to start from that sense of our shared security and shared economic security, which is part of our national security.
There isn't a summit with the EU this month, as there was going to be because of the change of British Prime Minister. What do you want to see from that summit when it does happen?
So there's some work that we've been had underway that follows the last summit and is about completing the work that was done as part of the last summit. I think there are, and some of the work around the SPS and some of those things that need to be fully completed and implemented. I think there are a couple of other areas where we want to go further. So around the recognizing the security defense relationship, for example, and the defense industrial relationship, making sure we don't end up with protectionism between us on some of those relationships. Also, I think there are areas where we can do more on illegal migration, working together, and areas where we can do more in terms of that sort of shared looking outwards as well. Some of the work that we've done with the E3, looking outwards, some of those shared foreign policy approaches too.
Thank you for that. Let's move on to a different question, again, one that you touched on in your article, and I was very struck by this, as were others, talking about the Middle East, and actually specifically Israel's behavior. You said we need to go further on enforcement, including new sanctions and greater action against trade with illegal settlements, and stronger action against those who are trying to destroy any chance of a two-state solution. And there do seem quite a few people around you might put in that category. What do you propose that Britain could do?
So when we made the decision for the historic recognition of the state of Palestine, alongside other countries in the autumn, and the work that was also being done at the time by the Arab League, I think last autumn there was a sense of the whole world coming together around not just trying to secure a ceasefire for Gaza, but also a broader vision of that two-state solution. And I think when the 20-point plan was drawn up for Gaza and when that ceasefire was secured with a huge international consensus behind it, there was a sense of hope at that point, a sense of optimism that we'd not felt for a long time.
The Security Council actually agreed on that.
Exactly.
One of the rare things these days.
Council agreement with the whole that underpinned, all of that whole agreement. And what I fear now is that 20-point plan is really in danger of just running into the ground. And we've seen we don't even have the humanitarian access and support that was pledged as part of phase 1 of that 20-point plan in Gaza. So there's still a continuing humanitarian crisis without the most basic of housing or support being able to get into Gaza. We've also seen, obviously, the settler, the expansion of the illegal settlements in the West Bank and the settler violence increasing and what is effectively, in many cases, settler terrorism as well. And so therefore it can feel then as if there's a risk now that we are going backwards. That progress we'd hoped for on the two-state solution, which is the only way to have security for Israelis and Palestinians alike, we are going backwards on that. And the Israeli government's restrictions on the humanitarian aid going into Gaza and the failure to have the proper accountability and protections on the West Bank in so many of these areas. So we are looking at what more we can do. We've announced recently a further wave of sanctions for settler violence in the West Bank. But what we're looking at in 2 areas is what more can we do to go further around the sanctions regime? And developing, expanding the sanctions regime, not just on individual sanctions, but looking at the sanctions regime more widely. And then secondly, looking at what more we can do around restrictions on trade with illegal settlements as well, and looking at what other countries have been doing. So we have a lot of work underway, a lot of issues that we're looking at. But I think the broader thing, though, is we have to restore the sense of international energy behind not just the 20-point plan, but actually a two-state solution. We had it in the autumn. We've lost it since. We have to restore that sense of energy behind it.
One of the questions we've been discussing early in the morning came up very explicitly in a session with David Lammy and Richard Hermer about international law. There was a lot of feeling in the world that international law applies to lots of countries, but not those who feel they can get away with ignoring it. And at the moment, aspects of that could be said to be true of the US and China. How would you make the case for following international law to the US and China?
So there's I mean, look, the debate is ongoing, isn't it, about whether we're moving back towards just a sort of great power politics, and I think, look, there was something of that in Tony Blair's essay. That's a sort of sense of, look, this is great power politics, and you align with the great powers. I think what the UK has always long stood for has been championing the rule of law. It's been something that's been really important for our identity across the world, and also makes us a trusted partner in a whole series of our alliances and relationships. And therefore, I think that sense of respect for international law is hugely important. And I would not underestimate the number of countries around the world who want to see international law being championed, want to see that being something that is central to the way that we operate internationally. There have always been disputes over individual cases and over the operations of some of the most powerful countries in the world, but I think still those principles are really important, and are things that in the end I believe still are in all of our interests. And it's why, I mean, look, we're having debate now about freedom of navigation, and that is something that actually I think there is a global consensus still around, other than from Iran, and where the US will argue for support for freedom of navigation, so will China, so will a lot of other countries are saying how important it is to have that respect for the law of the sea and for international shipping routes. It's made most acute in the Strait of Hormuz. I sometimes point out to people that we have the Straits of Dover, which has more international shipping go through it than the Straits of Hormuz and the Suez Canal put together. But we, despite that potential interest, we are strong champions of freedom of navigation, no tolls, no restrictions on shipping as well, because that's important. And I think that is in all countries' interests.
Yes, I hadn't focused on the UK being in possession of a choke point, as it's now fashionable to call it. Where are we on Ukraine? And can Ukraine force an end to this on acceptable terms for itself without US help?
So we obviously had a lot of discussions about Ukraine at the NATO Council meeting over the last couple of days, and where I think there's been a real shared understanding is how much pressure Ukraine is now putting Russia under. We do have, obviously, the support and sanctions that are immensely important as well. Nevertheless, it's what Ukraine has been able to do on the battlefield, what they have been able to do in terms of the impact. I mean, Russia has lost 500,000 Russian lives, Russian soldiers' lives in the last 4 years. And that is for just a demonstration, I think, of Putin's disregard for human life. But it's also facing now real economic pressures as well. So recruitment pressures in terms of them being able to sustain their armed forces, but also the economic pressures as a result of some of the strikes on energy infrastructure, the queues at the petrol pumps as well, and the fact that everybody's assumptions that Ukraine was just going to win this, that Russia was just going to win this within a matter of weeks or months, and now 3.5 years on, we're at this point. And therefore, Ukraine does need our continued support. We have 100% solidarity with Ukraine, and it has to demonstrate that that is long-term support. We did see, I think, the very support that President Trump gave at the NATO Council meeting to Ukraine. I think that is very important, but also the 70 billion euros committed for this year by European and Canadian allies as well. But that sense of us showing we're committed to the long term. Putin has consistently underestimated Ukraine and underestimated Ukraine's friends. And therefore showing that commitment for the long term, as long as he thinks he can outlast Ukraine, he will continue with this war. As long as we can demonstrate, actually, we will be with Ukraine every step of the way for as long as it takes, that, I think, increases our chances of bringing Russia back to the table and having some kind of negotiations to reach a peace settlement.
Thanks very much indeed for that. And all of the optimistic points, and there have been a lot today, as I was saying earlier. I know the commitment at the NATO summit to Article 5, a point George Robertson was making earlier, but actually these alliances getting reaffirmed. as we're looking at them. I want to come to questions now. The Foreign Secretary's time is very short. I know a lot of hands are going to go up. I think they will. Let's come to questions. If not, I have tons of others who would like to ask a question. All right, there's one at the back there on the aisle.
Hi there, Mark MacDonald, Chatham House member. Just given the imminent change in leadership in the UK government, do you expect a pivot on foreign policy from the UK perspective, or any other sort of rebalancing of views in that respect?
So we expect Andy Burnham to become the next Prime Minister, and I strongly support that. I think he's the right person to do that. And I've had conversations with Andy about foreign policy. I spoke to him before going to NATO this week, and he has been really clear about the importance of 100% support for Ukraine, about continuity in our approach to NATO, to our security issues, and also on so many of these vital relationships across the world. You may have seen the article that he's written in the Times, which again I think reflects very much of those same principles about recognising the dangerous nature of the world that we are having to live in, but also Britain's strengths, the need to build Britain's strengths and resilience, and also to be able to work in partnership and alliances. So I think those issues, those overall issues, will continue.
Thanks very much indeed. Here on the aisle, second row.
That's very kind. George Freeman, UK Trade Envoy. Nice to have you as my boss, Foreign Secretary. Look, as former Minister of State for Science, I wanted just to highlight the global race, the intensity of the global race for science and technology.
George, may I ask you already if this is going to be a question?
It is.
Thank you.
Do you recognise that I think there's a growing sense that people in this country want us to be a force for good in a sort of Carneyite middle power role, rather than a slavish ally to Donald Trump and possibly any new American president? Do you recognise that? And do you think it's a choice, or do you think we can have our cake and eat it?
So I think there's probably two things in there, because there's both the science and technology issue and also the issue about what role does the UK play in the world. Of course, we have immensely close and important security and intelligence relationship with the United States going back for many generations. That is hugely important to us and will continue to be so. We also have issues where we disagree. And we have disagreed clearly on Greenland, for example, earlier on in this year, where we made very clear our view about the sovereignty of Denmark and of Greenland. What we also did was we worked across NATO allies to build the Arctic Sentry, which we were advocating for, which was a way of drawing together a multilateral NATO approach to the security of the High North, rather than a fragmented, fractured approach, which is what seemed to be being proposed at that time. So I think that is a good example of us both maintaining a principal position was different from the US position, different from President Trump's position, but we also worked to use our relationships to build a shared and multilateral way forward. So that's why I think we can maintain. We did a similar thing. We obviously took a different view, very different view to the US at the start of the conflict with Iran, and we didn't provide support for the offensive operations against Iran. We did, however, provide defensive support when our Gulf partners were facing attacks and threats from Iran, and we are now working to seek to get the Strait of Hormuz opened. Final thing on the science and technology, massively important, and the UK has a distinctive role to play. Our universities, our science technology capability, immense, including on AI, where we are the third country in the world. That may be significantly behind the US and China, nevertheless, third country in terms of developing capabilities, and also the lead country on AI security. And that's where I think, and that links actually to what a lot of the work that Rishi Sunak did, but that this government has built on. We can play, I think, a really important convening role on how we build guardrails, how we build standards for the future around AI.
Thanks very much indeed. Woman here on the aisle.
Hi, thank you. I'm Rachel Eicher. I'm a researcher at the LSE and previously with USAID. And I was wondering if you could speak to the restructuring of staff at FCDO and Britain's diplomatic corps, given the complexity of the challenges you've outlined, and also the need for soft power that many people have also spoken about. Thank you.
Yeah. So the FCDO, the combined size of the FCDO had become, over a period, has expanded to the point at which I think it was more than 20% more staff than the two separate institutions of the Foreign Office and DFID put together. Obviously, all departments face fiscal pressures, and we have to make sure that we are using the money most effectively. And so some of the FCDO 2030 reforms, which started before I became Foreign Secretary, have been a response to that. And some of it has actually been about making sure we have the skills, the talent, and the support for the expertise that we need for the future, and making sure we can respond in a really agile way to really fast changing issues. I think soft power has always been a hugely important part of what the UK does. And when I asked the question of ambassadors around the world is, what does the country that you serve in, what do they think of the UK? And actually one of the things that came back most strongly continually was about the value of our universities. Another that came back around our respect for the rule of law. And some of those issues that become crucial part of our soft power. And of course, you know, football, our Premier League, is significant at the moment. We did have a discussion at NATO between me and the Norwegian Foreign Minister about the upcoming match, and whether Marco Rubio was going to be going to watch it in his home state as well. And perhaps he needed to have a big, you know, conference or something that he could just invite all these foreign ministers to as well. Our soft power is always going to be an important part of what we are and who we are in the UK, and will continue to do so.
Okay, thanks very much. Right here in the front.
Thank you. Marwan Yagi, the political counselor at the Embassy of the State of Palestine. Firstly, I want to thank you for your leadership, especially in the last decision that have been taken by Your Excellency regarding the illegal settlements. But my question is more of about Andy Burnham and the last statement that he have done, that he think that the UK government position was not like wrong when it comes to Gaza. However, what do you think Andy Burnham will bring in something new to the table when it comes to the foreign policy of the UK government in Palestine? Thank you.
So I think Andy's, again, has a strong sense of both the issues around security and values, which are some of the points that I was making earlier on. And so I think some of the things that he's talked about today is about recognizing how devastating it is, the humanitarian crisis that is happening now in Gaza, and also the escalating tensions around the West Bank. I think also, I know from the conversations that I've had with him, he is interested in some of the points that I was talking about earlier, about areas that we're looking at to try and go further around the sanctions regime, and also looking at the issues around trade with illegal settlements. But look, ultimately, those are issues that, you know, Andy will need to set out himself, and want to say what he wants to take forward, and so on. But I think and the other things I think he was also talking about was recognizing as well the deep trauma and distress that was caused on October the 7th, and the impact that that has had, as well as now seeking to find a way forward towards that two-state solution, and the need to be able to challenge and address what is happening now.
Thanks for that. We've got room for one or two more right over here on the wall by the window.
Suhadir from Chatham House CFC. Foreign Secretary, thank you so much for the keynote. I was just wondering, in the absence of a public China audit, what is the roadmap, if any, that your government is laying down for the UK's potential engagement with China in the future? Thank you.
Thanks very much. And let me say the CFC, the Common Futures Conversation, is a conversation brokered by Chatham House amongst selected young people from right round the world. Their questions tend to be extremely good.
So when we think about China, we know that that means security threats, from things like cyber threats that we face. It's also our third biggest trading partner in the world as well. We know that we have some shared geopolitical issues that to discuss, for example, as both members of the P5 on the UN Security Council. So when I was in China a few weeks ago, actually a lot of the issues that we discussed were around Ukraine and what is happening in terms of Russia and Ukraine, and also around the Strait of Hormuz. On Strait of Hormuz, we had shared interests with China and shared interests and agreement around the importance of freedom of navigation. And so I was talking to the Chinese government about what more pressure they could also put on Iran in terms of reopening of the strait. On Russia and Ukraine, we've obviously taken very different views. And again, though, I think it was right to be raising those the concerns that we have about the way in which China has not challenged Russia on Ukraine, and we've seen some continued support in a whole series of areas. So I think we have to have a relationship with China which recognizes all of those things: the security and security threat issues that we will always take a strong response to, the economic relationships and trading relationships that will continue to be important for the future, and also to engage with them on a whole series of foreign policy issues where both we and China can have an impact around the world.
Thank you very much. I can get, I think, one more in. I'm looking at a lot of hands. There's a woman over here.
Hello, I'm from the Chatham House Russia-Eurasia programme. What will it take for the UK and its European allies to extend a no-fly protection zone over Western Ukraine? This isn't about protecting Ukraine, it's about protecting NATO member states from Russian missiles and from Russian drones. What will it take for us to be more proactive?
Well, we've taken a strong response anytime we have had any of the drone incursions, any of the impact on NATO airspace, and right that we continue to do so. Also, I went to Poland in recent weeks, a few weeks ago, to see the concrete trenches and the anti-tank defences that they are putting in place along the Kaliningrad border and the Belarus border as well, as a recognition of the deterrence that we need and how seriously they take the threat from Russia. NATO is a defensive alliance, and that is important, and it is important that we recognise the aggression comes from Russia, and we respond with deterrence in terms of NATO, and we also support Ukraine to defend itself. And we've continued to do that in terms of providing them with defence and military support, and also providing them with infrastructure and energy support. And that, I think, is the right approach. We have that combination of the huge support for Ukraine, but also the defensive deterrence in terms of the way in which NATO responds as a whole. That was what we discussed at NATO, and what also we discussed with Ukraine. We had a dedicated session, as you would expect, with Ukraine, both with the foreign minister and also the leaders met with President Zelensky as well.
Thank you for that. And we've arrived at the end of our time. Before I thank the Foreign Secretary, I want to ask you one thing. You can join me in thanking the phenomenal Chatham House team who put this conference together. They have been absolute stars, and that's a great proportion of our staff have been involved in putting this together. And with that, Foreign Secretary, thank you very much.